I wanted to make a video that went through all the steps of working on a mix, from receiving the tracks in from the producer through the decisions I've made. And critically, this video is going to talk through why I made decisions I've made, what I'm trying to achieve, and the positive effects that's going to have for the outcomes for this piece of music. Let's go. Original mix. So the artist's description was that he felt this track was like a painting to him, and the reference he gave me was this track here called Easy Mark.
I'm hurting you back, just like everyone else. So come get me away from the back.
And the first thing I noticed about the reference is it's a really clean, beautiful sounding production. It is quite a different style track, but I get the point. This reference has got loads of kind of nice pads and things, and they're all really well separated out. They're all really clearly in their space. The other thing I noticed when I compared the reference to the original was there's a very different tonal stance. So the reference is quite even sounding, whereas the artist mix, the demo mix, all sounds very congested in the mids. I'll just do a flip between them, you can see what I mean.
So come get me away from the back.
My process for mixing is to start from the top and work down. So the first thing I want to do is get my levels set up so that I've got the right kind of volumes coming in, so that I'm hitting my mix bus, I'm hitting my master bus in a way that I want to. The first thing I did was I used my Elysia EQ on the mix bus here, and I just grabbed it and I was trying to find the frequencies that were pronounced and using that as a way to adjust my ears to get the artist mix to sound much more like the reference. And it's not that there's only one sound that's MIDI, it's just because there's like an overlap of these various sounds. So I have left some of those on the EQ here, but in the end I've done a lot of the work at track level. I use that to start with to try and find the problems, or to try and find the areas of focus. I've ended up on the mix bus though with a low cut, so I'm cutting away some of the very sub frequencies. I have got a dip. The dip is around 500 Hertz, a couple of dBs. Feels like quite a lot, but you know, I have done track level work as well. This seemed to come out right. And I've used the passive massage function, which is like it rolls off some of the very highs, but also gives a little bit of a peak as well. So it's brought out some tops, but also taken off some of the extreme highs. It doesn't always work. On this track, it's worked nicely. Before the Elysia EQ, I have the SSL Bus Plus, and in this case, I've got that just running as a very sort of standard SSL compressor with the feed forward mode activated and the low THD, and it's just doing a couple of dBs of gain reduction. So my mix bus then is a little bit of compression, a bit of EQ, and then I'm running into the God particle, which is what I'm using for my master. I'll probably come back and revise the mastering processing later, but I like working into the God particle because it lets me know what it'll sound like mastered, and it gets my level up. This is operating at 100% of its processing, which is multiband and some stereo widening, and then it's got some limiting going on. Yeah, like 1.5 dB of limiting, and that's getting us an average level of, well, -9 at this section of the track, with the most 2 dB of limiting. So that's exactly where I want to be. I've got a loud mix, but I'm not having to limit the hell out of it. I'm hitting my mix bus here. I've got the VU meter, where I want to be. That's set to -18, and I'm hitting 0 on the peaks. So my gain staging is set up correctly, and the simple way I do that is I just select all the audio files and I gain them down or gain them up. In this case, everything's come down 3.5 dBs. Let's talk through some of the specifics I've done. The kick, I thought, was one of the bigger issues with the way that the tonality of the track sounds. So let's just go back. Let's run how it sounded at the start. This was the kick. That's how it came out. And I thought that was too focused in this kind of area, particularly on my small speakers. That was jumping out a lot. So what I've done is I have used neutron in quite an extreme way to carry out some processing to the middle of that kick. I spent a while playing with EQ, but in the end I went with neutron, and what I'm doing is I'm reducing the attack and the sustain of this mid band here. So that's the processed kick. That's how it was to start with. And now so what I've done is I've just changed the character of it. I've got rid of some of those mids by reducing the sustain, particularly in the low mid area, and I've brought out some of the sub area by increasing the sustain on the low frequencies, and then also at the tops I've increased the sustain. So I've just tried to kind of play with the envelope of the kick a bit. It's not a super short kick, and it doesn't have a massive spiky transient that some do, but most of the energy was focused in that mid band, and I thought that was adding up against other elements in the track to cause that area to sound overly accentuated. So the kick's always a big feature in electronic music, and I wanted to make sure that the kick shape fit well around the other parts so that it doesn't poke out annoyingly or doesn't detract from the sounds of other instruments in that space. So that was a big move. I also then did a little bit further tonal shaping with EQ, took off some of the very subs and the very tops, and then again dipped in this area here. So let's hear the difference that makes. It's most obvious in the tops. And now I did these EQ moves in the track rather than solo, because what mattered was how the kick sounded in and amongst everything else. So that's the kick processing. It's this going to a clipper after that just to take some... In fact, I don't even think it's taking anything off. Yeah, a tiny little bit. So I'm always managing my peaks as I go through the process so that I'm not hitting all the peaks into the limiter at the end. But in this case, it's just set to shave a little bit. And that's more acting when there's a few parts running on this group here. The drums are separated out. I've just got kick and then these few sort of snare bits here on this group. Yeah. And that's given me control, because what I wanted was to be able to treat the higher parts of the drums differently. Initially, I had all the drums on one group, and they were going to my Heritage Audio successor compressor, but I did not like what it was doing to the kick. So I took the kick out, put that somewhere else, and I've got the high percussion elements going through a few tools to manage the transients. So I'm using a Studer tape emulation to manage the transients. I'm using Soothe to just control some of the very high frequencies, and I'm using the I/O plugin to send the whole group to my successor. We've got a few things in this group, but it's mainly hats and snares. Here we go. As we get into this group, all I've done really with these drum parts is little bits of peak management with the clipper and EQ. We have quite a bit of work on the hats. I wanted to bring out some of the lower frequencies on the hats because it was all quite toppy. So I've got this EQ here, enhancing some of the mids on the hats so that they're not all focused at the top. You can see from the EQ curve. Beyond that, on individual hats, I'm managing particular frequencies because they were building up. Again, these are all relatively subtle moves, nothing on that one. But I found that I had a frequency build-up in the tops that just needed taming a bit so that when all the hats are on, it doesn't sound too overwhelming. So if we turn all those plugins off, that's how it was before. It's all quite hissy. So I brought some more body out the hats there. And the reason for that is so that it doesn't get painful when turned up loud. One of my little tests is to crank the volume really loud for just a couple of seconds. And if there's anything jumping out and stripping my ears off, I know I need to go and fix it. And that was the case here. So these hats sounded good, but I just needed to pull back the aggression slightly. And that's how I've done that, just with some bits of EQ. On the rest of these parts, again, the same sort of thing. The cymbal just had some of the very tops taken off. And that's partly because I've introduced high end on the mix bus, so it might seem counterintuitive. But overall, the whole mix needed a bit of a top end tilt, but some of the parts got a bit bright as a result, so I've backed them off. And I still prefer that way of working rather than boosting highs in lots and lots and lots of places. A general high boost across the whole mix, I kind of like the way that works. So let's have a listen to the drums. And let's put it in the track. And compare to the original. So the drums aren't massively different. That's because they didn't need to be massively different. Like I say, I just wanted to change the tonal balance of that kick. What is quite different is the tone of the bass. So I've done a range of work on the bass, and a lot of it was to affect how the bass is performing on small speakers. So I use these little hi-fi speakers here to check how things sound, and I found that the bass was very sub-heavy. So initially the bass was like this. So you can hear that the R bass that I've used and the EQ have pronounced this set of harmonics and reduced the fundamental. So the fundamental, which is where the sub frequencies, it sounds great on big speakers, but it's also in a similar space to the kick. Now I've done some work on the kick, and it was just disappearing on small speakers. So I've used R bass, and what R bass does is it re-synthesizes some of the frequencies. So that's added in a bit more around the 100 hertz and below area, and then I've also boosted that to bring out those bits. So let's do the AB on the bass. So that's before, and that's after. Now the reason, as I say, is this is to mean that when you listen to it not on a big system, it's still going to sound full and powerful. So on a phone or on a small hi-fi or in the car, we're still going to have the warmth of the bass. I also controlled some of this area because I found this was in the mix. That's one of the areas where there was a build-up, so I thought the bass could move back in that space. I've changed how I've processed the bass through the song, so it's slightly different processing. I've backed off some of those EQ moves a bit. In this case, I've pulled down the 250 area as well on this bass. It's a slightly different bass sound anyway. So I've pulled that bit back as well there. And the whole point is that as the arrangement changes and as other instruments come in and out, the way the bass sits needs to change a bit. So I've processed it differently. I could have automated the EQ, but it was just as simple to just create a new track. Okay, cool. Then at the end, there's a bigger drop. Let's just have a listen to that section. So for this big drop, I really wanted it to have impact and energy so that it gave you the feeling that you wanted to kind of dance. And the thing that was causing my problems here is that I felt that the side chaining of the instruments against the kick weren't getting me the clarity that I wanted. I actually had a look. If you zoom in at the waveform here, it looks like the side chaining that's been done isn't quite lined up. So the waveform gets quieter here, but actually the kick has already happened. So option one was to take the bass and slide it to the left so that the waveform lined up. But then you end up with this extra bit of attack on the bass, which isn't right. So what I did was I've added an extra compressor that's just on this section, which is side chained off the kick, so that in this bit we're changing the envelope of the bass a bit. We're getting rid of that little peak there because we're now compressing it off the bass, off the kick. So if I put that on with the kick, it's a little bit subtle, but what it's done is just leave a little bit more room for the kick to come through, the attack of the kick, without the bass being there. And then that gets out of the way and leaves the side chaining that was already done on the bass to act as well. So I've not moved away from what the producer was doing, but I've just made sure that that little bit of attack there, you can see it every time where the kick hits. I've just got rid of that bit of attack. The other thing I've done is, and I do this quite a lot, is I've used Soothe to just duck the very low frequencies of all of the bass off the kick. So this is great because it means that as the kick changes in tone, the bass moves out of the way. So if we look at this, there's the kick. And so all I'm doing is I'm getting the bass to move out the way just in that frequency, whereas when you use a compressor, it's moving all the bass out the way, which is what I wanted to do with the attack in this section. But earlier in the song, I just want the low end of the bass to move out the way when the kick hits, when the low end of the kick hits. So this is running throughout every section. So I'm just controlling the bottom end with Soothe. It's a brilliant tool for just making space without it being so obvious, where a compressor can be over obvious. I've grouped all the parts into what I've classed as lead, pad, synths, and obviously the piano bit here. This has just helped me with my workflow. It's arguable about what sits in each section, but the main things I've done with all of these elements are around tonal shaping and volume automation. Right at this point in the track, we've got several things at the same time. We've got a lovely pad, we've got a synth sort of lead part, which is also kind of paddy, and we've got the vocals. So if we have a listen to that section. Okay, so my main objective here was to make sure that my intro was loud enough, which is where this pad starts. Then that as the next parts come in, that they move into the foreground, so the vocals come up, the pad comes down, and then as this synth comes in, I bring it in quite quiet and then it peaks here. You can see that there's already been some volume work here by the producers. I just wanted to make sure that there's these nice transitions and it gives that picture of a painting, so things are morphing and moving without being really obvious. So if we compare the artist mix at that point, it's already like that kind of painting, but the problem is that everything's kind of overlapping. So as well as the volume moves I've done, there have been some bits of EQ. So on that synth part here, I've boosted some of the high mids and taken away some of the lows. I've just tilted it a bit to get it away from some of the other parts. On the main synth, I haven't done anything, so I've left that as is. But on this pad, I've done almost the opposite to that lead line, so I've brought out the low mids so that now one's lower, one's higher. I've used Soothe to manage some of the kind of peaking frequencies here. I've used Spectre to even further enhance the high mids, so we've got a bit of a boost here. So that's ducking around 1.5. I'm now boosting around 3, and this is to help it cut through. So I've used Spectre because there wasn't much already there in the part, and Spectre uses distortion, well, saturation, to add harmonics in that area. And then I've got a compressor doing ducking, but that's the mix is on, it's on 0%. That only comes in later in the track. So it's opened up, and what it's meant is that now working alongside this synth, they're both in their own sort of spaces. Okay, so with the volume moves, they kind of blend, although they're in their own spaces, it blends into this picture, which kind of gives that idea of a painting. The rest of the synth parts kind of follow similar, with bits of EQ moves to try and see a big reduction there in the low mids. If you remember from the outset, I said there was quite a lot of mids going on, and I've tried to get rid of some of those in some parts to allow them to feature in other parts. Not much else has gone on through those sections. The piano, though, this is a big part for me, and I really wanted to help bring it to the fore, so I've done a few different things with this. So we've got some dynamic EQ just managing that high part that comes in there. Again, little moves. I've got a dip here because... Again, I'm trying to watch out for that build-up of frequencies in the mids there that I talked about earlier. I've used this new waves curves equator. This has worked really well on that particular frequency band. And because it's cutting down on the low mids, it uses like an auto gain thing, auto makeup. So because I'm cutting down on that bit, it's sympathetically boosting the other areas to keep the overall volume up. So again, it does like a balance shift. I've got another EQ. I don't usually stack EQs, but I've obviously done that because later on I was like, yeah, I still need to do some work on that. And in fact, this one is automated. So in this first section, the piano is more of a feature, and I'll play that in a minute. And by this point, more other instruments come in. So I've reduced some of the low mids further in this section because they were getting in the way of some other parts. I've got L2 just managing peaks. One there, like tiny bit. So this is all about just making sure that we don't end up with really sharp transient peaks stacking up and hitting the limiter at the end. So I've just got a little bit of control there. The main thing, of course, that I've also done is volume automation here. So I've brought up that kind of... That's more of a feature, so that's come up there. And then in this earlier bit where it's on its own in the track, I've added a further reverb just to boost this part here. And it's a reverb with some EQ and a big pre-delay. So we get this. So let's put it in the track because that's what really matters. And the reason for doing that is I really liked that part, and I thought it just needed a little bit of interest and change, and that's where the creative work of mixing comes in. It's not always about control and manage and this, that, and the other. It's about how do I make the story of this track move and shift and keep interest for people, and so that's what that little bit there is for. So it's a bit of ear candy, really. So if we go back to the original mix at this point. Instead. I've got a bit quiet actually, that part. And similarly, this synth here, I've got an echo on it just to add a bit of dimension, bit of width, and also to separate it out from the piano. So the mix now, with all those little changes and those tucks and stuff, it's glued together more. It feels fuller, it feels warmer, but it's got more interest. It already was interesting, there's a lot going on, but I've just found a little bit of space for things, and I've just started on the journey of adding those creative touches. The last thing to talk about, which is probably the most important, is the vocal. Now, this is already really well produced. There's lots of treatment and stuff going on. So my role here isn't to redo that work. My role is to make sure this sits nicely in the track. So what there was quite a lot of build-up in the top end on the vocal. You can kind of hear that enhanced kind of sound. So I brought that back a little because I found it was a bit overwhelming at moments. I've got soothe acting a little bit lower because we've got frequencies there. Let's have a listen to the delta. So we've got some harmonics, some parts of the vocal sound that are just a little bit pokey there. So again, bringing that back a touch. So there's the control elements. And then the last thing is I've used the LA2A, particularly where there's several vocals.
Fade to black.
Only a little bit of gain reduction. I just wanted to glue them together a little bit and make sure that they don't get too quiet or too loud at any one point. So 1 to 2 dBs isn't much, but it's just enough to kind of just nip and tuck it into place and keep the vocal forefront without it being super loud. So on the lead vocal, which is from here, I've used some dynamic EQ. So this is just, again, gentle control over some of the more peaky parts. There you go, there. So... And obviously it's been really processed and treated, and so in the treatment that's been done by the producer, that's probably quite likely brought out some of those elements. But again, my objective with the whole mix was to try and smooth it out a bit so there wasn't too much overlap. And then there are parts of the track where it does get a bit more jarring, and that can work better then because they stand out a bit more because everything else is a little bit sweeter. So that's what those EQ moves are for there. Nothing on that one, a little bit on this one. Same thing, some dynamic EQ. Let's have a look at that section. Yeah. I'm watching for overlap and build up across those two parts of vocal there. That one's also got, yeah, again, some dynamic EQ. You get the general idea. I'm just finding where there's bits that are just overlaying. I'm just controlling them a touch so that I'm not getting too much poking through. I didn't do a great deal to the vocal. As I say, it was already well produced, and you know, it's the producer who's the singer, so he knows what he wants. It's not my job to completely undo that. It's my job to make it all work as a whole. So let's move a little bit later into the track and look at this big drop then. Okay, so a bit of volume automation leading into that to get that main pad in focus. Okay, you can see the compressor come on there for where the drop happens, and that's the sidechain compressor on that main pad just to allow the kick to take focus there and drive the track on. It sounded a bit to me like it was a little bit choked in the artist mix at that point, and I was trying to unchoke it by using some sidechaining. So here's the original. And it is at that point where that tonality of the kick that I've worked on with Neutron really kind of is apparent. Versus... So I feel like I've just opened it up a bit, which has brought it... It's not the same, but it's brought it closer to the reference. Very different track, of course. There's a level of clarity to this that I was trying to get towards. Yeah. So even at this loudest part, let's see what God Particle's doing. Not a great deal. And look, I'm getting, you know, -9, -8 at times. In the main, I'm not getting massive peaks that I'm having to squash with my mastering limiter. I'm getting volume throughout the track because of the way it's been sound designed. It's great big sounds. And then the way it's been processed already by the producer. There's no massive transients on things. And then I've just brought any little build-up of transient under control with a bit of clipping or a little bit of limiting. And then I've got some mix bus compression for glue. Yeah, I'm happy with where it's at. It's not finished, but it's definitely in the right direction. Wicked.